Hi guys, how are you? Thank you for being a part of The Good Farm. If you're here, you're curious about how to cook delicious beef and perhaps intrigued as to how to cook certain cuts of beef. Many of us are familiar with many different cuts, but not all of us are familiar with all the different cuts. And therefore, each month I want to showcase one particular cut and how to best cook it for best outcome, for best experience. Because 99 times out of 100, when you experience something that's tough or lacking, it's not succulent or it's dry, it's not the fault of the raw material necessarily. It's probably because it's been poorly managed from a heat perspective, or the heat treatment wasn't right for that cut. So I think it's important over the course of time that we look at all the different cuts that we have in our box, and particularly the ones that we might not be so familiar with. So today I want to look at the blade steak. Now, somewhat confusing with blade is that it sits in and around and on and under the shoulder of the beast, and therefore it's got, just like we have we have shoulder muscles, and we have 12 shoulder muscles. The cow has about 4 or 5 different sort of parts of the blade, which makes it quite confusing. So there's terms like oyster blade or polar blade or flat iron steak. They are all under the umbrella of blade. And then of course when you go to the States or the UK or Australia, all those different 4 or 5 muscles or cuts all have their different terminology, all have different names. And so now you've got 15 to 20 different names for different parts of the same thing. So it gets very confusing. All you need to know for the purposes of today is that blade steak is a secondary cut. However, if it's managed in the right way, it can be a stove top or a griddle steak. And so I've got two cuts out of the blade. I've got the oyster and I've got the flat iron steak. Now I'm going to attempt to cook the flat iron on the stove top here, and I've got a dressing and I've got some delicious, beautifully fresh bok choy, and it's going to be very simple, very easy. I'm actually going to leave the oyster until my family get home. They're just on the school run. I don't want to cook it too ahead of time. But the oyster is called the oyster because of that seam down the middle. Hopefully you can see that. Very distinctive. And arguably one of the reasons why it's not so high up on the list for people. People reach out for a sirloin or a rump or a fillet, steaks of that nature. Whereas something like an oyster blade or a blade in general might be sort of thrown into a casserole or maybe a stir fry. But I want to prove that we can cook it on the stovetop. Okay, so first things first, when you're cooking steak, any steak, particularly stovetop stuff that requires high heat and a quick cook time, is that you get it out the fridge nice and early ahead of the cook time. So I brought that out about 30, probably 40 minutes ago. Some chefs say an hour before, some say 10 or 20 minutes before. Somewhere in between, I reckon, is about on the money. You want the steak to slowly come to more or less room temperature. The worst thing we can do, particularly if it's a stovetop steak that you're after and it requires a lot of heat, short period of time, is that the core of that steak or that piece of protein, because the same rules apply to fish and chicken, is the core of that piece of protein being chilled. And so you want as close as possible for that steak or chicken or fish to be close to room temperature. So half an hour before, whip it out the fridge, and you're pretty much good to go. So what I'm going to do is cook the steak. Whilst that is resting, I'm going to look at the salsa, or the dressing that will drizzle over the top. It's a very sort of I guess, Asian inspired. We've got some garlic, lime, chili, ginger, some fish sauce, some honey. It's going to be really delicious and complement the steak really nicely. So I've got some water. I want to put that on first. Simultaneously, I want to put on a pretty high heat, and I've got a really thick cast iron pan here. So it will take, you know, a good 45, 60 seconds to get up to temp. Then my recommendation when you're cooking steak, particularly stovetop stuff, is olive oil to start with, right? So it's got a high smoke point. It can tolerate a lot of heat. It's fairly stable as opposed to canola or sunflower or safflower or high industrialized oils of that nature. So olive oil is a good staple to have in the kitchen. It can tolerate a lot of heat. So I've got that on an 8. My thing goes up to 9, and then there's fucking supersonic. 8 is probably a really good place to start for this induction and this pan. This isn't a particularly thick flat iron steak or feather blade steak, so it's gonna cook pretty quick. So, you know, 2 minutes on either side. If it's hot enough, there's going to be enough residual heat to cook it all the way through. And I like it sort of on the rarer side of things. Okay, so while that's coming up to heat, I'm just going to prep these guys. Okay, a little bit of salt in the water. Getting ready for the bok choy. Okay, so that pan's starting to smoke. So let's get some olive oil in there. You know, probably, you know, a decent glug. And now we need to season this steak. So don't be afraid. Use salt liberally. Use some salt and pepper, both sides. You can even put a bit of oil in on this at this stage. So salt, you know, it gets a bad rap, but all we need to know for the purposes of today is that it helps to form that crust. It helps to form that caramelization. And that's all part of the experience. You need that crust. And that comes down to salt, pepper, and that correct heat management. Okay, I think we're good to go. I'm just going to grab some butter. So right at the end of the cook, we can baste this with a bit of butter. Again, that helps to add some nuttiness, some caramelization to the steak. All right, so when you're putting the steak in to hot fat, put it in away from you. Okay, again, he's not very thick, that guy, so he's not going to take very long at all. Okay, so meanwhile, I want to get onto this dressing. So there's a few different elements to it. So we've got some limes. So the juice of 2 limes. So it's quite a, you know, pungent, bitey, chili. You know, you could add some fresh herbs to this, like coriander, and I have done in the past. But today, I think, you know, those 6 ingredients, you know, if you want to frame it like six ingredients divided into 3 wet, 3 dry. So the dry are the garlic, the chili, and ginger, and then the wet, the fish oil, the lime, and the honey. Okay, so we've got 2 large limes there. I'm going to put half this chili in. Okay, so that steak's probably been in there for, and apologies, I don't have a camera right over here. That's probably been in there for a couple of minutes. I'll just flip him over. So we're starting to get some caramelization. You're starting to get a crust over the top of that, and it's looking pretty good. Still on an 8, still nice and hot. Okay, so 1 garlic, about 1 centimetre squared of fresh ginger. You can either use a spoon or trim it off with a sharp knife. Okay, some fish sauce. And then there's a lot going on, so you want to like soften a lot of that. So there's going to be a lot of heat, you know, heat from the chili, heat from the garlic, heat from the ginger. So you just want to take the edge off that with a bit of honey. Okay, bok choy in. Okay, beautiful. Okay, I think now's a good time to put some butter in. Again, oil first. Let the majority of the cook be as a result of having oil in the pan, olive oil preferably, and then towards the end you can put a decent dollop of butter in. Because if you put butter in too early, you're going to get that burnt result. You know, if this is more of a sort of Mediterranean Italian dish, you could get some thyme, some fresh rosemary or some garlic and rub those elements onto the steak. Okay, I might just turn him up a little bit. So this bok choy, we've got some salted water. That's only going to take, 90 seconds or so, and then we'll drain it. We'll wait for the steak. The most important thing, there are some rules around, people say there's no rules to cooking, and I do subscribe to that to a degree. I think thinking that there are too many rules imposes this resistance, puts barriers in front of for people, and I think that's not necessarily a positive thing. There are definitely rules around baking and chocolate. It's more of a science. This kind of cooking, there's less of a science, but I think there's some really strong must-dos, if you like, to ensure that you get the best result. Things like getting it out the fridge 20, 30 minutes before you're cooking. Good pan, high heat. Olive oil to start with, then butter towards the end. A few aromatics if you want. Now what we're doing, we're flipping every so once in a while, and this is helping to keep an equal cook and keeping the moisture evenly spread within the steak itself. Okay, we've got some nice colour there. And also one of the other must-dos when you're cooking steak or piece of fish, piece of chicken, piece of lamb, whether it's a quick cook or even a slower roast, is to rest your meat. Resting the meat allows all that moisture that was in the protein to redistribute to every facet, part, corner, nook, cranny of that protein again. It allows just like bringing the protein out of the fridge, once it's chilled in the fridge, it's sort of bound up, and so is the moisture. Bringing it to room temperature allows it to get to every nook and cranny. The same principle applies when you come off the heat. Allow it to come, not back to room temperature, but allowing, depending on the cook time, allow for 10% of the cook time to be allocated for resting. Okay, so we're going to drain this and just leave that to one side for the moment. Okay, so just going to wipe that board. So this is looking pretty delicious. I'll show you in a second. So hopefully you can see that. It's not too smoky in this kitchen, but we got some great caramelization on both sides. And the other thing to bear in mind is that when you're carving your, in this instance, your blade steak, is to go against the grain, okay? If you go with the grain, what you end up getting is long pieces of fibrous meat. So you're going with the strand, you're going with the filament, if you like, of the muscle. And so if you carve the other way, it's just easier to break down, it's easier to manage in the mouth and to digest probably. So just bear that in mind. Same with the chicken breast, you go against the grain, perpendicular to that. So I can see here that the grain's going this way, so I'm going to carve that way across the steak. But he's happy, just sitting there resting on the board. Again, depending on the cook time, for a steak like this, you know, probably had 6 minutes in the pan and therefore, you know, probably 5 on the board or on the plate. If it was a roast, then it would have a longer rest time and you might want to cover it. If I covered this, I would steam it to a degree and I would get rid of that crust on the outside, unfortunately. Okay, so we've got that dressing. Hopefully you can see that. Beautiful color, very pungent. You know, we've got that garlic, we've got the ginger, we've got the chili. And of course with 6 elements, you just need to make sure that it's nicely balanced. Let's just say I was glad I only put half the chili in. So I'm just going to put a little bit more honey in. But that's pretty good. Okay. So we've got some bok choy. You know, they only had about 90 seconds, so there's still a bit of, you know, there's still a bit of crunch in the base there. I'm going to finish that off with some sesame oil. Delicious. And now, typically I would season the steak again. I'm not going to do that. There's plenty of, you know, salt in the dressing. So I'm not going to, you know, if after the first mouthful I feel like I need salt, but I think there's a risk of over salting if I was to season again now. Okay, I reckon another 30 seconds of rest time and I can carve him. It's really important, don't be afraid of seasoning though. So season before and during, and baste with salted butter during the end of the cook time, and you should be in for a pretty good end result. All right, let's cut this, sorry. The other thing with cutting steak, don't be tempted to cut too thin. You know, you think about moisture disappearing, evaporating once you cut it through. That's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to dry your steak out and it's going to be a poor experience. So don't be afraid of thicker cuts. That is looking delicious. So I'll just wipe that board down and then we'll apply the dressing. So hopefully you can see that. There's some beautiful pinkness in the steak, a nice crust on the outside. We've exposed it to high heat, some good heat management. We've allowed it to rest. I can guarantee if I plowed into that the moment the meat hit the board, it would be a different result. And then some delicious spoonfuls of this pungent, spicy, tangy dressing. Put some on there too. Okay guys, I thought that might be an alternative for you to see how potentially you can cook blade steak in another way. It doesn't have to be destined for a casserole or a stew. It can be stovetop and it can be delicious. So there you go guys. That is a flat iron steak, aka a feather blade steak, aka a blade steak, cooked on the stovetop with some bok choy and a beautiful pungent tangy dressing. Thanks for listening, and I hope to speak to you soon.